Welcome to the WanderLearn Show. I'm your host, Francis Tapon. I'm here once again with Robert Edwards. We talked before about George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, about the Mount Everest mystery that was 100 years ago, and his book, The Last Step But One, which is fabulous. You can go follow the link in the corner to see that. Those actually two interviews regarding that topic. But today we're going to talk about another controversy, and that's about D.B. Cooper, person who hijacked a plane and got a lot of money. I can't remember the exact amount of money, and then jumped off the plane in a parachute and disappeared. And some of the money was discovered many years later, but D.B. Cooper, his identity, and whatever happened to the rest of the money, all that remains a mystery until this day. So welcome back, Robert.
Thank you very much, Francis. Again, I'm happy to be on the WanderLearn channel
Thank
for
you.
the second time, and I hope that what we're going to talk about will be of interest to your readers and your audience who want to wander and learn. And there is certainly a wander and learn aspect to the D.B. Cooper story.
And to all your books, actually. You like to tackle these mysteries and controversies. That's your expertise, and you're adding that kind of mathematical, probabilistic thinking mind to analyze the data and just look at the data and then share that, and then let the reader decide what to conclude. So, real fast, did you want to add anything to the quick summary that I gave about D.B. Cooper that you think, from a 30,000 foot level, we should note?
Only that clearly D.B. Cooper was not his real name, and it was not even the name that he gave to the airline. He wrote, or rather, he asked the ticket salesperson to write the name Dan Cooper. That's the name he gave. And through misunderstandings in the media, that name became transposed to D.B. Cooper, the name by which he's known to this day.
Right. So let's start with the airline's flight path, or actually go back one more step. This is back in the day, way before 9/11, when
Yes,
you could basically walk in with a bazooka and nobody would care.
correct.
I'm young enough to remember, like, there was no security. It's like getting onto a bus or getting onto a train. It was the same idea. Nobody checks you.
Exactly.
And so he came in and he handed a note to one of the flight attendants, and then
Right.
said, "Hey, I've got a bomb, and and land this airplane, put in a bunch of money, and then we take off again, and you're going to follow my instructions." Basically, is that fair enough to say? I mean, really?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes,
Now,
that's correct.
how much money was it?
$200,000 in 1971.
And roughly the worth of
That
that?
would be, I would say, well over $1 million in today's money.
Okay, well over $1 million. Okay, so not a bad paycheck. And then they landed, and then they took off, I believe, from the Seattle airport.
That's correct. He asked for a landing at Seattle, SeaTac, in fact, and for $200,000 to be ready, along with 4 parachutes. And he let the passengers off the plane. He retained one flight attendant and the flight crew. So there were 4 people with him on the airplane, and he asked them to go to Mexico City. And
And
so they
this,
started off south.
so he hijacked flight 305, correct?
Correct, yes.
And that was the original flight, and it became its own private plane for him on the way. What?
Yes, it's traditionally known as 305, although, of course, 305 terminated in Seattle. So going south to Mexico, it didn't really have a flight number at all, but we still know it as Flight 305.
Now, Dr. Edwards, the flight path is a critical thing to know to figure out where he might have jumped off. Because if you're just off by a few degrees, of course, that could throw you off by hundreds of kilometers and ruin your search. What is, according to your best research and according to your book, the probable flight path that the plane took after it left from SeaTac?
Okay, the flight path is a very interesting issue, and there has been some controversy over the path that the airplane took, compounded by the fact that the FBI have released what they say is a map of the flight path, but they have never claimed authorship of that map. They have left it completely uncertain as to who created that map and who were the parties who played a role in drawing up the map. It's safe to guess the US Air Force was involved. It's not clear whether the Air Force, in fact, created the map, whether Northwest Airlines were involved, whether anybody in the FBI played a part, but there definitely is a map, and you will find it to this day on the FBI website.
There are some holes to this map, in other words, right? There are some issues that the map has that may make it not entirely accurate or even plausible.
There are some reasons to doubt the map. First of all, the map is, if you look at the image of it on the FBI website, you can see that it's a very long roll of paper, approximately 6 feet long and about 18 inches wide. It seems to be laminated in some way, and the photograph is clearly a photograph of the map lying on the floor, slightly crumpled up, and by no means a good or clear scan of the path. And that has been an issue which many people have raised as to that this map is not accurate, and in fact, the plane went somewhere else altogether. But let me say that I did, in my book, devote a considerable amount of effort to validating the map. And I looked at maybe 8 different sources of data that would enable me to triangulate whether the map was, let's say, sufficiently reliable or not. And at the end of the day, I concluded that the map, I have no reason to challenge it.
Okay.
I believe that the map represents a flight path which is essentially down a federal low-level corridor, which is known as Victor 23, which starts at the Canadian border and goes all the way down to California. And Victor 23 is also a phrase which has entered the mythology of the D.B. Cooper story. There is, in fact, a bar in Vancouver, Washington, called Victor 23, and it serves craft beer, artisan beer, and it's full of memorabilia about the D.B. Cooper case. So Victor 23 is one of the buzzwords of the Cooper case.
That's fascinating. But safe to say, to sum it up, is that even though the map may not be entirely reliable and entirely perfectly accurate, it is roughly, most likely, correct in a rough way. And so then that brings up the next big question, which is, where did he exit? What point did he jump off the plane? And that is a much harder question, I think, to answer.
Yes, that is probably the central point of controversy that has been present through the whole history of the Cooper case, which now spans 53 years. And I think it's safe to say, and in some sense we're cutting to the chase here, that the FBI made a call on that exit point very early in the case, and I believe that they called it wrong. That's an argument which I set forth in my book. And the essence of the argument, now this is where we probably need to get into a little bit of technicality. There were a series of aerodynamic phenomena that occurred during the flight, starting at about 8:11 Pacific time. And these events are known today by 2 different names. One of them is called the oscillations. Now, the oscillations mean the movement of a little gauge on the flight engineer's station on the flight deck. The flight engineer was the first person to notice these oscillations on a single gauge, and the gauge was called the cabin rate of climb gauge. Now, the flight engineer is sitting behind the pilot, so he cannot see very much out the window. He's just looking at the gauges. And he told the pilots, the pilot in command and the first officer, that he's seeing a movement on a gauge. And it's the cabin rate of climb gauge. Now, this is recording the pressure in the cabin. And you and I know that when we board an airplane, as the airplane rises, the cabin pressure also decreases, but obviously it doesn't go down to the level of outside. We travel in pressurized airplanes these days, and so it goes down much more slowly than the actual airplane. But nevertheless, the pressure is decreasing in the cabin, and that's what the flight engineer was seeing. He was seeing flickers on this gauge. And that became known as the oscillations, which again is a central buzzword to the Cooper case. The oscillations. This was the key to the call of where the hijacker left the plane.
Right. And one key point for those who are not terribly familiar with the case, what made this plane unique, and it doesn't exist anymore, it had the back of the plane could go down and fold down into a staircase while the plane is flying. And that's exactly what DB Cooper did, which is he had them lower, basically open up the plane, and so that he could jump off the staircase that is in the back of the plane while the plane is in the air. And that opening of the back door, and maybe when he jumped out, could have changed the pressure within the plane ever so slightly. And that could be the wobble that was referred to, right?
That is indeed one of the main points of discussion in the Cooper case, whether, as you say correctly, when the hijacker opened the aft air stair, the ventral air stair, whether changes in pressure resulting from that opening caused the oscillations which the flight engineer said. And it was indeed a central assumption of the Northwest Airlines and of the FBI that the oscillations marked the hijacker's departure. And that, I think, was probably the first error which led to their looking in the wrong place.
And they also did something, a specific experiment. They had a model airplane of it, flew it up in the air, and took all sorts of measurements to try to re-simulate the situation and reproduce it. And what were the conclusions of that whole expensive experiment that they did after?
Okay, well, first of all, Francis, that was not a model airplane. That was the original Boeing 727, which had flown Flight 305. A Boeing 727 Model 51, call sign November 467, Uniform Sierra, exactly the same airplane. The identical airplane with a slightly different crew. They got the same flight engineer to get on that plane and let them know what he saw. And they took it out over the Pacific Ocean and attempted to replicate Flight 305. And they did indeed take measurements. Those measurements have never been placed in the public domain. But evidently, there was something about those measurements that led them to believe that they had replicated the flight sufficiently accurately that their assumption was, let's say, a reasonable base for starting. And on that basis, they said, yeah, the oscillations marked the exit. However, as I said a moment ago, I think they were wrong. And that's where everything started to go awry.
You go into incredible detail in your book, DB Cooper and Flight 305 is the name of the book. And I'll have a link to it in the description. Now, you go into incredible detail, but if you can succinctly summarize, what do you think are the main problems with the reproduction of that flight and the measurements that they took, and where did they go wrong? Or at least what cast doubt in your mind?
I won't call it an error, really, but let's say a misunderstanding on the part of the FBI was this misunderstanding of what the oscillations implied. Firstly, and I'll come back to what I said a moment ago, the oscillations were not a single event. They were the start of a sequence which continued for an undetermined time. And that length of time has never really been understood. I personally feel that it was in the nature of several minutes. In other words, it wasn't like a quick fluctuation of a gauge. It was a series of fluctuations which continued over time. The crew discussed it. They were wondering what was happening. They knew the hijacker was on the air stair. They were wondering whether he was jumping on the stair, causing the pressure to move. They were not sure. And this discussion continued for some time. And I don't think back in 1971, the FBI were even aware that this had been a sequence of several minutes. This didn't, in fact, come into the public domain, and you'll be amazed at this, until 2014, when the flight engineer, who by then was a man in his probably 70s, if not 80s, gave an interview to some private investigators who are on one of these internet forums and told his story more clearly than he had ever told the FBI. And what he said was, well, the oscillations went on for some time and we were talking about it and we didn't know what was happening. And then all of a sudden we had a bump, and he called it a pressure bump. He said we felt it in our ears like a pop, the same kind that you sometimes feel, used to feel in airplanes when airplanes were not as well pressurized as they are today. But it tends to be you don't feel those pops in airplanes anymore. But they felt, at least some of them felt, a popping in the ears. This happened, who knows when, some minutes after the oscillations started. And then they said, well, that must have been the jump. He's just left. But still they were not sure. And they never told this to the FBI. They never told it to Northwest Airlines. They kind of kept it to themselves.
Probably because
And
they
at
thought it
some
was
point they
not
made
that
it.
important.
I think they were not sufficiently sure that the guy was still on board or not. And they were afraid to go back and see. He had told them to stay on the flight deck and not move. So they did not want to take the risk that the guy, who presumably still has his bomb, should get upset if they go back and check if he's there or not. And therefore, for the whole rest of the flight until they landed in Reno, Nevada, they called him, are you still there? Is there anything you need? Are we doing it right? And he didn't reply. And they kept thinking, well, he's still on board as far as we know, until they land in Reno and they go back and he's gone.
Right. What
And
about
at that point, they know he went, but
Correct.
who knows when.
What about meteorology? What role did that play regarding the wind patterns and things like that?
Well, meteorology for me was a very central part of my analysis, and it formed a very um, critical part of my book, because it seemed to me that the FBI, again, not being meteorologists, not being aircrew, not being pilots, could only work with the data that they had. Now, the meteorology of the flight, and very specifically the wind speeds and wind directions, are very important for us to know where the airplane was at any given time. Because you know the flight path, but if you do not know where the airplane was on the flight path, then you do not know at what point they cross this landmark or that landmark, at which point they cross the Columbia River, for example, enter Oregon. This is all a little bit uncertain. And I think it's kind of a pity that the FBI got rather incomplete information on the winds in particular. They essentially, I believe they called the National Weather Service in Portland, Oregon, and they got a rough estimate of where the winds were at the surface and an even rougher estimate of where they were at altitude, where the airplane was. And they said, well, that's good enough. And what else do we have? We have winds at Salem. Okay, let's take the winds at Salem again. We'll apply an average and we'll say that's good enough. Well, the problem is that if an airplane is traveling at 3 nautical miles per minute, that's not good enough. That's not good enough to put boots on the ground and start looking for people at great expense. So long and short of it is the FBI, with the information that they had, came up in conjunction with Northwest Airlines of a time of 8:11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And again, in conjunction with Northwest Airlines, they said, well, the airplane at that time was approximately a small town called Ariel, Washington, which is near the Merwin Dam on the Lewis River, about 30 miles north of the Columbia. And they said, okay, that's where we are going to search. And as history records, they did search that area. They put boots on the ground. They brought in the Army. They brought in the National Guard. They brought in the Sheriff's Office from Clackamas and Clark counties. And thousands of people searched that area. And as history records, they found nothing. A very expensive assumption.
Right. And in the end, when a little child, I can't remember how old he was, but he was maybe like 12 years old or maybe less, who found a bunch of $20 bills buried in the sand, in a sandbar, basically, downstream.
Yeah.
Now, people have then tried to figure out, okay, where that obviously must have come downstream. So where would DB Cooper have landed? Maybe we can get to that later, because I know also we need to address another issue, which is the communications with the crew and flight controllers and things like that. Maybe we should address that
Francis,
first.
we should probably come back to the finding of the money. That is certainly a very critical part of the story, and it really drives the conclusions that we have to draw about the hijacker's departure. But like you said, we should, I think, first address the communications, because they are, again, are a very important part of the story. Now, Northwest Airlines, with this very old model 727, had got two radios tuned to voice frequencies. So they were able to talk to two different people at any given time. Now, one radio obviously had to be tuned to air traffic control, which means that leaving Seattle, leaving SeaTac, they had to first communicate with a SeaTac tower, and then they would have to hand over to what's called Seattle Center, which is the Air Route Control Center, which controls airplanes in flight, in cruise, and they're based in Auburn, Washington. So they had one radio tuned to Seattle Center for as long as they were within the airspace of that center. And later on, they switched that radio to Oakland Center. But the important part of the story is the Seattle Center talking to Seattle Center. The second radio was tuned to a company frequency. It was known in those days as an ARINC frequency, because ARINC was the contractor who maintained these radio frequencies, and they allocated this frequency to Northwest. And that enabled Northwest to talk to their own people in Seattle. And obviously nowhere else in the USA, because the radio signals travel in straight lines. You can only talk to Seattle. But Northwest, being based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, really needed to talk to the crew directly. And it took a little bit of time before that was set up that they could talk to Minneapolis. Okay, anyway, the point of the story is there's two independent streams of communication going on between the airplane and people on the ground. And those two streams of communication are extremely different from each other. There's information that goes to air traffic control which doesn't go to the company, and there's information going to the company that air traffic control never know about. And again, part of my research was try to make sense and try to synchronize and try to work out what happened when, matching these two things up.
How do those communications indeed affect our knowledge about where DB Cooper took off? How did that screw things up for us?
Two things occurred which screwed things up. Number one, when they were talking to Seattle Center, that's to say, to air traffic control, they were speaking to a series of different controllers. And the controllers had certain areas of responsibility. And as the airplane passed from one area to another, you would switch from one controller to another. And each controller would tell the airplane, okay, you're leaving my area, switch to operator 5, radio 5. This is the frequency. And the crew would say, okay, understood, we are switching to. The first radio operator that they spoke to after leaving SeaTac was at a station called R2, Romeo 2. And I've corresponded with that gentleman who handled the flight at that time. He's now in his 70s. Very nice guy. And he periodically shows up at what they call the CooperCon, the Cooper Convention in Seattle, and shares his recollections of that fateful day. So I corresponded with this gentleman. And I learned, yes, he was indeed at R2 on that night. He didn't talk very much to Flight 305. He knew there was a hijack going on. His job was simply to track the airplane on radar, make sure that they were within the corridor, and take the basic minimal information that is required between an air traffic controller and an airplane. And when they were nearing the edge of his responsibility, he said, okay, switch to this frequency. And he gave them 133.9. And that was a mistake. He gave them the wrong frequency. He should have given them another frequency, which was for the next controller at the low level. Instead, he gave them a high level frequency, which belonged solely to a remote station called in Redmond, Oregon, which handled high-level traffic.
And why is that important? Why does that mistake ruin everything?
It's a mistake because the crew, obviously, not knowing the frequencies, would assume that was the correct frequency. And so one assumes they would try to transmit on that frequency. However, they were out of range of Redmond, so they would have been talking into dead air. And the consequence of that is they're calling Redmond, they're saying something like, and I'm imagining this, they're saying, Flight 305, Seattle Center, this is Flight 305. And then they wait. And there's no reply because Redmond Center, there's no people there. It's an automated station. There's nobody sitting in Redmond. And Redmond, in any case, is more than 90 miles away, so they will not.
What happens? But what I understand that there was a gap in the communications. But in a parallel universe, Robert, what would have happened had they had proper communications, live communications? Do you think what information would we have gleaned?
Okay, if they had in fact got the right frequency and called the next controller immediately, then we would not have had this 14-minute gap in the communications. And they might have released something important, like they might have said something about their airspeed. They might have said, we're changing altitude, we're changing airspeed. They would have given routine reports, which would have told us something more about where they were.
But hold on. Did they ever post hijacking? Did they ever say, yeah, we told all that information and it got, as you say, we speaking into the wind? Did they ever, did they in fact try to, or I guess because they never got a response when they said, hey, this is Flight 305, Roger, come over, and then there was dead silence, they'd never even bothered to waste their breath saying anything more than that, right?
We simply do not know. From that date until this day, the crew have never said in the public domain what happened during those 14 minutes. Did they attempt? To be honest, well, first of all, I don't know. And Francis, when I don't know, I always like to tell you I don't know.
Right.
But my guess is they might have tried one transmission, and then probably they thought, well, okay, they didn't reply, let's leave it. We have a hijacker in the back. This was their major concern. They were extremely worried about this guy in the back with the bomb. And I think if I were a pilot and I had a guy in the back with a bomb, I would call air traffic once, and then if they didn't reply, it's not my problem. I would say, I've got a guy in the back with a bomb. I need to figure out what he's going to do. Is he going to jump? We know he has parachutes. Is he going to jump? Is he going to fire the bomb? Have we done anything wrong? These guys, I think, are very, very tense. And there's a rule in aviation. It's number one, aviate. Number 2, navigate. Number 3, communicate. I learned that myself in flight school. So communicate is third on the list. First priority is aviate. Make sure the airplane is stable. Make sure the airplane is going in the correct configuration. Got the flaps down, you got the gears down. Are you near stall speed? Anything might go wrong. It's dark outside, you don't have visibility. You aviate. After that, you navigate. After that, you communicate.
Right.
So my guess is probably they didn't try very hard until maybe later on they picked up the right frequency and came back to air traffic control. The second stream of communication was with Northwest, and that was a much more generous, much more comprehensive stream of communication. They were talking to Northwest much more than they were talking to air traffic control, which is normal. With air traffic control, you don't say more than you need to. You know that you don't need to give position reports because they have you on radar. They know where you are. So you're not going to say where you are. But to Northwest don't have radar. They need to tell Northwest where they are. So to Northwest, they're giving position reports. And on the airplane, on a 727, indeed on all airplanes, there's a little device on the flight deck called the DME, stands for Distance Measuring Instrument. And you periodically read that. I used to have a DME on my little airplane when I used to fly. And you record it, and you're measuring a distance from a certain beacon. And you read that, and then you can tell anybody where you are. And I think one of the great gaps in my knowledge and in everyone's knowledge of this case is that in the very critical period when we assume or we imagine that the hijacker departed, there were only 3 position reports. And the 2 of them occurred very close to SeaTac at 14 and again at 19 nautical miles, which is not much use to anybody. And the third occurred 23 nautical miles south of Battleground, Washington, by which time they were well into Oregon. They were kind of abeam a small town called Tualatin, Oregon. And so between the second and the third position reports, it's practically, I don't want to say certain, it's very probable that that's where the hijacker jumped. And again, from this very generous stream of communication, we don't have enough facts to really pin it down.
Got it. Well,
if they had given a position report saying crossing the Columbia, that would have been good, but they never gave it.
Well, we will definitely try to pin it down more carefully in our next episode. We're going to be interviewing you. So please stay tuned. Subscribe to the WanderLearn show to get the next episode featuring, once again, where we will continue this conversation. We'll be featuring Robert again, where we will discuss other issues regarding D.B. Cooper. We'll talk about his possible or probable planning process. We'll talk about his prior life experience that he may have had that helped him do what he did. We'll talk about the precursor, the events that came right before the jumps, the airdrops involving the 727, and the significance of the surviving physical evidence that we have found, and the really juicy details about that. So tune in soon, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Robert. See you soon.
Thank you, Francis.